"You're hoarding space," my son-in-law, Marcus, screamed, hurling the 1982 vintage champagne against the marble fireplace. The bottle exploded on impact. Shards of green glass and foaming wine, Eleanor's favorite vintage, kept for a milestone we would never share, sprayed across the hearth like shrapnel. The room went dead silent, save for the crackle of the fire hissing as the alcohol doused the logs. My daughter, Sarah, didn't gasp. She didn't check if the glass had cut me. She simply looked at me with eyes devoid of the warmth I had nurtured for 40 years and coldly added, "He's right, Dad. The Sullivans need this place more than you. You better leave." I sat there for a moment, the smell of burnt oak and wasted champagne filling my nose. I was in the estate I had engineered, sitting in the wing I had built, surrounded by traitors masquerading as loved ones. They wanted my Newport home for Marcus's grifter parents. They wanted me gone. I didn't scream. I didn't fight. I simply smiled, a dry, engineering assessment of a structural failure. "As you wish," I whispered. I stood up, walked out of the library, and stepped directly into the blizzard swirling outside. I sat in my freezing car and sent a single command to the trust server: execute the bad faith clause. 5 minutes later, the smart home system clicked into lockdown mode. They thought they had inherited a castle, they had just trapped themselves in a freezer. The engine of my rover hummed to life, a low, steady vibration against the howling wind tearing off the Atlantic. I didn't drive away immediately. I sat there at the end of the lawn, heated driveway, watching the warm glow of the library windows where my family was currently celebrating their victory. They would be pouring another drink, likely that cheap swill Marcus brought, congratulating themselves on finally bullying the old man out of his fortress. They didn't understand that the heat, the lights, and the security system were not rights. They were privileges granted by a server I controlled. The digital key in my hand felt heavy, not with guilt, but with finality. Eleanor had warned me years ago that Sarah's husband was a structural weakness in our family foundation. I had refused to believe her then, thinking love could reinforce any crack. I was wrong. The blizzard battered the windshield, burying the estate in white, erasing the footprints I had just made. It was fitting. The house, the breakwater, was designed to withstand hurricane-force winds and salt spray, but it was never built to withstand the rot of entitlement from within. Inside, the Sullivans, Marcus's parents, were probably already measuring the master suite for drapes. They had arrived with luggage that looked suspiciously like moving boxes, complaining about the draft before they'd even taken off their coats. They called my home a waste of resources, while eating the food I paid for, drinking the wine I aged, and warming themselves by the fire I tended. The audacity was breathtaking, a perfect architectural marvel of greed. I glanced at the dashboard clock, 8:05 p.m. The protocol would take exactly 15 minutes to fully engage. First, the perimeter gates would lock. Then, the smart thermostats would reset to 40 degrees. Finally, the backup generators would disable themselves, interpreting the unauthorized occupancy as a security breach. I wasn't leaving them to die, I was leaving them to experience the reality of the world without my support. They wanted independence. They wanted the house. They could have the structure, but they wouldn't get the lifeblood that made it livable. I shifted the car into drive, the tires crunching over the snow. To understand how a father could do this to his own child on Christmas Eve, you have to understand the morning that preceded the explosion. You have to see the cracks forming before the collapse. 6 hours earlier, the estate was silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer and the muffled roar of the wind testing the reinforced glass. I moved through the rooms of the breakwater with the precision of a curator, ensuring every detail was aligned to the millimeter. This house was not merely a shelter, it was a testament to 40 years of structural engineering and a shrine to the woman who had breathed life into its steel and stone bones. I adjusted the centerpiece on the dining table, a winter arrangement of white lilies and silver fir, centering it exactly beneath the chandelier. The silverware was polished to a mirror finish, reflecting the gray light of the approaching blizzard. I had spent 3 days preparing for this dinner, sourcing the ingredients, bearing out the guest sweets, and retrieving the 1982 champagne from the cellar's temperature-controlled vault. It was a labor of love, or perhaps, a labor of denial. I stood in the library, the very room that would later become the scene of the crime, and looked at the bottle resting on the mantelpiece. Eleanor and I had bought it in Paris during our 30th anniversary, vowing to open it when our first grandchild was born. That grandchild never came, and Eleanor left me 3 years ago, taken by a sudden stroke that defied all medical logic. Now, I intended to open it tonight, a peace offering to my daughter and her husband, a symbol that I was ready to move forward. I wanted to believe that the friction between us was just grief manifesting his distance. I wanted to believe that Marcus was simply misunderstood, not malicious. A structural engineer should know better than to ignore stress fractures, yet I chose to paint over them, hoping the foundation would hold for one more Christmas. The piece shattered at 2 p.m., not with a knock, but with the heavy thud of the front door being thrown open against the stopper. A gust of freezing air swept through the hallway, carrying with it the loud, abrasive laughter of people who lacked the refinement to respect the threshold. I walked into the foyer to greet them, a smile practiced and ready on my lips, but the words died in my throat. Marcus entered first, shaking snow from his coat directly onto the parquet floor, followed closely by Sarah, who looked everywhere but at me. But they were not alone. Behind them, lugging 2 oversized suitcases that looked suspiciously heavy for a simple dinner, were Marcus's parents, the Sullivans. "Arthur. Hope you don't mind the extra company," Marcus announced, his voice booming with forced conviviality. He didn't ask, he declared. He stepped forward, bypassing my outstretched hand to clap me on the shoulder with a patronizing heaviness. "Mom and Dad's heating went out, can you believe it? In this weather. Told them you had plenty of room. A fortress like this shouldn't go to waste, right?" I looked at the Sullivans. Frank Sullivan was a man who wore expensive suits that never seemed to fit quite right, and his wife, Joyce, wore enough jewelry to sink a small yacht. They smiled at me, but their eyes were busy scanning the foyer, calculating the value of the paintings, the rug, the crystal vase on the console table. "A pleasure, Arthur," Frank said, extending a hand that felt cold and damp. "Terrible inconvenience, truly." But Marcus insisted. "Said you were rattling around in this big old museum all by yourself." The insult was wrapped in gratitude, a technique grifters master early. "You are welcome, of course," I said, my voice steady despite the sudden tightening in my chest. "Let me take your coats." As I reached for Joyce's fur, I noticed her boots. They were thick with salted slush and mud, and she was standing squarely in the center of the antique Tabriz rug Eleanor had brought back from Istanbul in the 90s. The gray sludge was already seeping into the delicate crimson wool. "Please," I said, gesturing to the slate entryway, "the rug is an antique. If we could just step back onto the stone." Joyce looked down, feigning surprise, then let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. "Oh, Arthur, don't be so precious. It's just a rug. That's the problem with these old houses, everything is a museum piece. You can't actually live in them." She didn't move. Instead, she twisted her heel to remove the boot, grinding the grit deeper into the fibers. Sarah finally spoke up, but not to defend me. "Dad," Stop fussing. It's Christmas Eve. Don't ruin the mood before we've even started." I took their coats in silence, the weight of the fur and wool heavy in my arms. I watched as Marcus led his parents into the living room, pointing out features of the house like a real estate agent showcasing a property to prospective buyers. "Original molding," I heard him say. "Ocean view from every window in the west wing. Needs some updating, obviously. The windows are drafty, but the bones are good." He wasn't speaking as a guest. He was speaking as an owner assessing an asset. I hung their coats in the closet, taking a moment to breathe, to count to 10, to engage the same patience I used when waiting for concrete to cure. When I joined them in the living room, the dynamic had already shifted. Frank was sitting in my leather armchair, the one molded to my shape over 20 years of reading, and had already poured himself a drink from the crystal decanter on the sideboard. He hadn't asked. He held the glass of my 20-year-old scotch up to the light, swirling it critically. "A bit peaty for my taste, Arthur. You don't have anything lighter?" "A blend, perhaps." Marcus chuckled from the sofa, where he had his feet up on the coffee table, shoes still on. "Dad's a connoisseur, Arthur. You'll have to break out the good stuff." "That is the good stuff," I said, my tone clipping the end of the sentence. I moved to the coaster stack and slid one under Marcus's drink, then another under Frank's. The message was clear, but they chose to ignore the frequency. Sarah was by the window, looking out at the gathering storm, her back to me. She looked tired, her posture slumped, but every time she looked at Marcus, there was a flicker of fear mixed with adoration. She was the load-bearing wall that was beginning to buckle under the weight of his demands. I wanted to go to her, to ask her if she was happy, but the Sullivans were already launching their next offensive. "So, Arthur," Joyce said, patting the space next to her on the sofa as if inviting a dog to sit. "Marcus tells us you spend most of your time in the East Wing now. Is that true? It seems so silly to heat this entire place for one person. Have you thought about downsizing? There are some lovely communities down in Florida." Frank and I were just looking at brochures. The trap was not even subtle. They had been in my house for less than 20 minutes, and they were already mentally measuring me for a coffin, or at least, a condo. The tension in the room wasn't just social awkwardness, it was the hum of a high-voltage line waiting to arc. I looked at the grandfather clock. 2:30 p.m. The explosion was hours away, but the fuse had just been lit. "I believe in traveling light," Frank Sullivan said, watching as Marcus hauled the second massive suitcase up the curved staircase. The statement was a lie so blatant it practically had its own gravitational pull. The suitcase thudded against the mahogany banister, wood imported from Brazil in 1985, hand-polished by artisans who were no longer alive, leaving a white scuff mark that screamed of carelessness. I flinched internally, a microfracture in my composure, but I remained rooted to the spot near the library doors. Overnight guests do not bring steamer trunks. They do not bring boxes taped shut with industrial packing tape. They do not bring the heavy, distinct clatter of framed photographs and kitchen appliances shifting inside nylon shells. "Just a few comforts from home," Joyce chirped, catching my eye. She was already busy improving the living room. In the span of 10 minutes, she had moved the wingback chairs, positioned precisely to catch the afternoon light, to face the television. She had swept Eleanor's collection of porcelain hummingbirds off the side table and into a drawer, replacing them with her own clutter, a stack of tabloid magazines and a crystal candy dish filled with mints that looked a decade old. "This room needs flow, Arthur. It's too rigid. You engineers are all right angles and logic. A home needs to breathe." She patted a cushion she had just fluffed into deformity. "We're just helping you loosen up." I walked over to the side table and opened a drawer. The hummingbirds were piled haphazardly, ceramic wings pressing against jagged metal keys. I gently reorganized them, ensuring they wouldn't chip, before closing the drawer with a soft click. "The room was designed for conversation," I said, my voice neutral, devoid of the outrage burning in my gut. "The acoustics are optimized for speech, not television." Joyce waved the hand dismissively, her bracelets jangling like chains. "Oh, hush. Nobody talks anymore, Arthur. We watch. We consume. You're living in the past." Upstairs, the thudding continued. It sounded less like guests unpacking and more like a military occupation establishing a beachhead. I excused myself and walked up the stairs, my hand gliding over the scuff mark on the railing. I needed to assess the extent of the intrusion. The door to the blue guest suite was open. Inside, Marcus was not unpacking clothes. He was measuring the wall space with a tape measure he must have brought from his car. Frank was standing by the window, peeling the weather stripping back with a jagged fingernail. "Drafty," Frank muttered, not noticing me in the doorway. "Single pane. Jesus. The heating bill must be criminal." Marcus retracted the tape measure with a sharp snap. "We'll replace them. Triple glazed vinyl. I know a guy. We can rip these frames out in a weekend." Rip them out. The window frames were original 1920s oak, restored by Eleanor over 2 summers of painstaking work. They weren't just windows, they were the eyes of the house, and these men were discussing gouging them out to save a few dollars on heating they didn't pay for. "The windows are historical landmarks," I said, stepping into the room. Both men jumped. Marcus recovered first, flashing that salesman grin that never quite reached his eyes. "Arthur. Just brainstorming. Value adds. You know how it is. Asset management." He didn't step away from the wall. He stood his ground, claiming the space. "Dad was just saying how cold it is. You catch a chill easily at your age. We're thinking of your health." "My health is excellent," I replied, noting the open suitcase on the bed. It wasn't full of clothes. It was full of files. Manila folders, binders, stacks of paper. It looked like a mobile office. Or perhaps, the records of a bankruptcy they were running from. "And dinner will be served at 6 o'clock. I expect the measuring tape to be gone by then." I turned to leave, but stopped when I saw the bedside table. Eleanor's photo, a black and white portrait of her on our honeymoon, was face down on the mattress. In its place stood a framed photo of the Sullivans, smiling on a golf course I knew they couldn't afford to play on. I walked to the bed, picked up Eleanor's photo, and dusted an imaginary speck of dust from the glass. I didn't look at Marcus. I didn't look at Frank. I simply placed the photo back on the table, directly in front of theirs, blocking it completely. 6 o'clock, I repeated. The air in the room dropped 10 degrees, but it had nothing to do with the windows. It was the chill of a boundary being drawn, a line in the sand that they had already scuffed out. Back downstairs, Sarah was in the kitchen, staring into the open refrigerator. She hadn't offered to help cook. She hadn't offered to set the table. She was just staring, illuminated by the cold LED light, looking lost. "They brought a lot of stuff, Dad," she whispered, not turning around. They lost their lease. The landlord kicked them out yesterday." The confession hung in the air, fragile and sharp. "And you didn't think to tell me?" I asked, leaning against the granite island. You didn't think to ask. Sarah finally turned, her eyes red-rimmed. Marcus said you'd say no. He said we had to ease you into it. Show you how nice it would be to have family around. She looked at me, pleading for me to make this easy, to roll over and accept the burden so she wouldn't have to fight him. He says it's for the best. That you're lonely. I was not lonely, I said, looking past her to the living room where Joyce was now criticizing the fireplace draft. I was grieving. There is a difference. Sarah looked down at her shoes. She knew. Somewhere deep down, beneath the fear and the passivity, she knew this was an invasion. But she had made her choice. She had married a man who saw people as resources and homes as assets, and she lacked the structural integrity to stand against the load he placed on her. I turned back to the stove. The turkey needed basting. The potatoes needed mashing. The ritual of dinner had to continue, even if the guests were vultures circling the table. I would feed them. I would pour them the vintage wine. I would give them every opportunity to prove me wrong, to show a shred of decency. But as I listened to the heavy footsteps above my head, pacing out the square footage of my bedroom, I knew the verdict was already in. They weren't here to visit. They were here to conquer. And they had no idea that the fortress they were trying to storm was rigged to blow. The dining room was a theater of shadows and candlelight, designed by Eleanor to be intimate, a place where family secrets were shared in whispers, not shouted across the table. But tonight, the acoustics were being tested by the brain laughter of Frank Sullivan. He sat at the head of the table, my seat, the one I had occupied since 1984, without so much as a "may I." When I entered with the roasted turkey, a 20-pound bird I had basted every 30 minutes since dawn, Frank didn't move. He simply leaned back, wine glass in hand, and gestured with his fork towards the empty chair on the side. Sit anywhere, Arthur. We're all family here. No need for formalities. I placed the platter on the trivet, the heat radiating against my palms. The steam rose, carrying the scent of sage and thyme, herbs I had grown in the conservatory. The head of the table offers the best view of the storm, I said quietly, taking the side chair opposite Sarah. It also bears the draft from the chimney. I hope you brought a sweater. Frank chuckled, a wet, dismissive sound. I run hot, Arthur. High metabolism. Besides, this wine is doing the trick. Is this the 95? A bit acidic, isn't it? He hadn't even looked at the label. He was drinking a $200 bottle of Bordeaux like it was table wine from a box. Dinner was a study in gluttony. There was no grace, no toast to the chef, no moment of gratitude for the roof holding back the blizzard. Joyce Sullivan attacked the mashed potatoes as if they were a personal entitlement, piling a mound onto her plate that defied structural stability. Marcus poured himself a third glass of wine before the appetizers were even cleared. He held the crystal stem by the bowl, his fingerprints smearing the delicate glass. I watched him, analyzing his movements. He was jittery, his eyes darting between his parents and Sarah, checking the load-bearing capacity of his own scheme. He was revving up for something. You know, Arthur, Marcus began, waving his knife in the air, a piece of white meat still impaled on the tip. I was looking at your portfolio the other day. Sarah showed me the statements. I stopped cutting my turkey. I looked at Sarah. She was staring intently at her green beans, her face pale, shoulders hunched. She had violated the trust of my study, the one room in the house that was always locked. I wasn't aware my financial privacy was a topic for open discussion, I said, keeping my voice level. My study is locked for a reason. Sarah has a key, Marcus said, shrugging. And we're married. What's hers is mine. That's how partnership works. Anyway, you're heavy in bonds. Municipals. Real estate. It's dinosaur stuff, Arthur. Low yield. You're bleeding potential. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, invading the centerpiece. I've been telling Sarah, we need to modernize the Vance assets. Crypto, AI startups, leverage distincts. That's where the growth is. You're building with brick when you should be building with code. I built with brick because brick survives, I replied, taking a sip of water. I have seen code evaporate into thin air when the servers go down. I have never seen a building vanish because the internet connection failed. Frank snorted, wiping grease from his chin with one of Eleanor's linen napkins. Times change, Arthur. You got to pivot. Marcus here, he's a visionary. He's got the pulse on the market. You should listen to him. Maybe let him manage a portion. Say, the liquidity from the house. The room went silent. The only sound was the wind howling outside, battering the French doors like a fist. The cutlery stopped clinking. The air pressure in the room seemed to drop, signaling the arrival of the storm front. The liquidity from the house, I repeated, tasting the words. They were sour. I was unaware the house was for sale. Joyce looked up from her plate, feigning innocence. Oh, not for sale, Arthur. Leveraged. You take the equity out. Cash flow. Then you move somewhere, manageable. And we take over the maintenance here. It's a win-win. She smiled, a flash of teeth that reminded me of a barracuda I once saw in a reef documentary. We're just thinking of your legacy. You don't want this place to fall into disrepair, do you? A man your age, the stairs alone are a hazard. I looked at Sarah again. Is this what you think, Sarah? That the stairs are a hazard? She finally looked up, her eyes swimming with tears she was fighting to suppress. She looked at Marcus, who gave her a sharp, warning nod. It's a lot of house, Dad, she whispered. And Marcus's parents need a place. Their family. And the equity. Marcus says he can triple it in 6 months. He just needs the capital. Triple it, I said flatly. In 6 months. Guaranteed, Marcus said, slamming his hand on the table. The silver jumped. It's a sure thing, Arthur. But we need to move fast. The market waits for no one. We need you to sign the power of attorney tonight. Just for the property management. We can handle the rest. He reached under his chair and pulled out a leather folder. It was already prepared. The audacity was breathtaking. They hadn't come for dinner. They had come for a closing. I picked up my wine glass, swirling the dark red liquid. I looked at the 3 predators and the 1 hostage sitting at my table. They saw an old man, a widower, a relic of a bygone era who could be bullied into submission. They saw a resource to be mined. They didn't see the structural engineer who knew exactly how much stress a beam could take before it snapped, and they didn't see that I was no longer supporting the weight. I see, I said. You have the papers with you. On Christmas Eve. Efficiency, Frank grunted. Why wait? Why wait indeed, I murmured. I set my glass down. I think it is time for the champagne. The 1982. It seems we have a proposition to toast to. Marcus's eyes lit up. He thought he had one. He thought the resistance was crumbling. He didn't know that when a building is about to be demolished, the charges are set quietly, deep in the foundation, long before the button is pressed. I descended into the wine cellar, the temperature dropping a distinct 10 degrees as I passed the threshold. The air down here was thick with the scent of damp earth and aged cork, a smell that usually brought me peace, but tonight it felt like the air inside a tomb. I walked to the section marked 1980 to 1989, my fingers tracing the dust-covered labels until they found a 1982. The bottle was heavy, cold against my palm, a silent vessel of a promise made in a happier timeline. Upstairs, the floorboards creaked rhythmically, the distinct, heavy footfalls of Frank pacing, or perhaps dancing. They were celebrating a victory they had not yet secured, confident that the old man in the basement was merely fetching the ink for his own surrender. I paused at the bottom of the stairs, gripping the neck of the bottle until my knuckles turned the color of parchment. I could hear their muffled voices drifting down the ventilation shaft, distorted but decipherable. "He's a pushover," Marcus was saying, his voice loud, likely amplified by the acoustics of the hallway. "Sarah, you worry too much. The guy is tired. He wants an out. We're doing him a favor." I closed my eyes, visualizing the structural beams of the house, the steel I-beams hidden behind the plaster. They supported the weight of the snow, the roof, the furniture, and now, the weight of this betrayal. I wondered, in a detached, clinical way, what the load limit of a father's love actually was. When I returned to the dining room, the atmosphere had shifted from tense to conspiratorial. Frank had moved to the sideboard and was pouring himself a fourth glass of whiskey, abandoning the wine entirely. Joyce was leaning over the table, whispering to Sarah, who looked pale and nauseous, like a structure vibrating in a harmonic resonance that precedes a collapse. I placed the 1982 champagne in the center of the table, the dust from the bottle leaving a faint ring on the tablecloth. "The vintage," I said, my voice cutting through their murmurs. "As requested." Marcus clapped his hands together, a sound like a pistol crack in the quiet room. "Beautiful, Arthur. Truly. But before we pop the cork, I want to show you the upgrade." He reached into his jacket pocket, the jacket I had bought him for his birthday 2 years ago, and pulled out a trifold brochure. He slid it across the mahogany table with the slick motion of a blackjack dealer. The cover featured a generic stock photo of an elderly couple smiling vacantly at a sunset, with the words Silver Creek Senior Living, Dignity in Twilight printed in a non-threatening serif font. I picked up the brochure, my engineering eye immediately noticing the cheap paper stock and the pixelated logo. I opened it. It wasn't a luxury community. It wasn't even a condo. It was an assisted living facility 40 miles inland, a place known for its flickering fluorescent lights and the smell of industrial cleaner masking the scent of neglect. "A studio apartment," I read aloud, my tone flat. 300 square feet. Communal dining. Curfew at 9 p.m. I looked up, meeting Marcus's gaze. "This is your vision of modernization. You wish to trade a 5,000 square foot cliffside estate for a room the size of my pantry." "It's efficient, Dad," Marcus said quickly, leaning forward. "Look at the amenities. Bingo nights. Shuttle service to the mall. Medical staff on call. You're isolated out here. What if you fall? What if the power goes out? There, you're safe. You're managed." Joyce chimed in, nodding vigorously, her earrings catching the candlelight. "It's really for your own good, Arthur. We visited last week. The staff is capable. And it's so much cozier. You won't have to worry about the roof, or the grounds, or, she gestured vaguely around the room, all this dusting. I see, I said, placing the brochure down next to the champagne. And while I am playing bingo in a 300-square-foot box, who will be managing the burden of the breakwater? I looked at Frank. He was smiling, a grease stain glistening on his lower lip. We're willing to sacrifice, Arthur, Frank said, spreading his hands. Joyce and I, we can move in here. Keep an eye on things. Manage the upkeep. Marcus and Sarah can take the guest cottage. We'll keep the asset in the family. Maximize the equity. Maximize the equity, I repeated. By leveraging the deed to invest in, what was it? Crypto. Marcus flinched slightly but held his ground. It's the future, Arthur. The market is priming for a bull run. We leverage the house, put $2 million into the fund, and in a year, we pay off the loan and pocket the rest. You get the best care at Silver Creek, and we secure the family fortune. Everyone wins. I looked at Sarah. She was staring at the champagne bottle as if it were a bomb. She knew. She knew that Eleanor would have burned this house to the ground before letting these people turn it into a casino chip. Sarah, I said softly. Is this what you want? To put your father in a home so your husband can gamble with your inheritance? She opened her mouth, her eyes darting to Marcus, then to her hands. It's not gambling, Dad. Marcus has a system. And we need the money. The debt. The debt, I interrupted, the pieces finally locking into place. This isn't about investment. This is about insolvency. I looked at Marcus. The arrogance in his eyes flickered, replaced for a microsecond by panic. How much, Marcus? How much did you lose? His jaw tightened. That's irrelevant. What matters is the recovery strategy. And the strategy requires capital. This house is a dead asset. It's a pile of rocks sitting on a cliff. We're turning it into liquidity. A pile of rocks, I whispered. I looked around the room, at the hand-carved molding, the fireplace where I had spent 1,000 nights reading to my wife, the windows that framed the ocean she loved. He saw geology, I saw a sanctuary. The insult was so profound, so fundamentally disconnected from reality, that it didn't produce anger. It produced clarity. I realized then that there was no negotiation. There was no reasoning with a termite. You simply removed the wood or you crushed the pest. Marcus stood up, sensing he was losing control of the narrative. He picked up the champagne bottle, his grip clumsy and aggressive. Look, let's not get bogged down in the details tonight. It's Christmas. Let's drink to the future. To Silver Creek. To family. He began to peel the foil off the bottle, his fingers digging into the gold wrapping. You sign the papers in the morning, Arthur. It's the right thing to do. Don't be selfish. The word hung in the air, heavy and toxic. Selfish. The man trying to steal my home was calling me selfish for occupying it. The structural integrity of the evening finally gave way. Selfish, I repeated, the word rolling around my mouth like a stone I was testing for weight. Marcus didn't stop peeling the foil. The gold wrapping shredded under his fingernails, falling onto the pristine white tablecloth like cheap confetti. Don't take it personal, Arthur, he muttered, focusing on the wire cage. It's just economics. You're sitting on $5 million in equity. It's dead money. It's selfish to let it rot when it could be working for the family. For your grandchildren. He paused, glancing at Sarah's stomach, a manipulative non sequitur designed to twist the knife. There were no grandchildren. There never would be, not with the stress he put her under. Let us discuss economics, I said, my voice dropping an octave, finding that resonant frequency that used to silence construction sites. And let us discuss the definition of dead money. You mentioned crypto. Specifically, I assume, the arbitrage scheme you moved Sarah's savings into 3 months ago. The one that devalued by 60% last Tuesday. The wire cage paused in Marcus's hand. The silence that followed was absolute. The wind outside seemed to hold its breath. Sarah gasped, a sharp intake of air that sounded like a sob. She looked at Marcus, her eyes widening. You said that was stable. You said it was a high-yield savings account. Marcus's face flushed a deep, mottled red, the color of raw meat. He didn't look at her. He stared at me, his eyes narrowing into slits. You've been spying on me, he hissed. I have been auditing you, I corrected, leaning back in my chair. There is a difference. A spy watches for advantage, an auditor watches for structural failure. And Marcus, your financial foundation is not just cracked, it is non-existent. I turned my gaze to Frank Sullivan. He had stopped chewing, a forkful of turkey hovering halfway to his mouth. And you, Frank. You speak of managing my estate. Is this the same management style you applied to your dry cleaning business in Jersey? The one that filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy 6 weeks ago? The one with the 3 outstanding liens from the IRS? Joyce dropped her fork. It clattered against the china, a harsh, discordant note. How dare you, she sputtered, clutching her pearls as if I had physically struck her. We are in a transition period. The economy is hostile to small business. We are victims of the market. You are victims of your own appetites, I said, cutting her off. I pulled the public records this morning. You didn't lose your lease because of the market. You lost it because you haven't paid rent in 8 months. You aren't here to help me. You are here because you are homeless. You are looking for a host organism. I looked at each of them in turn. The predators were stripped of their camouflage. They weren't high society saviors, they were desperate, drowning people trying to climb onto my back to keep their heads above water. Marcus slammed the bottle down on the table. The heavy glass thudded against the wood, making the silverware jump. So what? He shouted, abandoning the pretense of politeness. So what if we're struggling? That's what family is for. You have everything. You have this museum of a house, you have millions in the bank, and you just sit here. You sit here waiting to die while we're out there fighting to survive. It is selfish. It's obscene. It is earned, I said, my voice cold and hard as steel. I worked 40 years for this house. Eleanor and I built it, beam by beam. We didn't gamble. We didn't take shortcuts. We didn't leverage our future on sure things and get-rich-quick schemes. We built on rock. I stood up slowly. My knees ached, a reminder of my age, but I locked them, standing at my full height. And I will not let you turn my life's work into collateral for your gambling addiction. Sarah was weeping now, silent tears streaming down her face. She looked small, defeated. Dad, please, she whispered. We can work something out. Just don't send them away. They have nowhere to go. They have a hotel, I said, not looking away from Marcus. I will pay for 3 nights at the Marriott. After that, you are on your own. But you will not live here. You will not touch the deed. And you will certainly not move me into a facility where the highlight of the week is bingo and the smell of despair. I reached out and placed my hand on the neck of the champagne bottle, which Marcus was still gripping. Now, I believe it is time for you to leave. The dinner is over. Marcus didn't let go of the bottle. His grip tightened, the veins in his forearm bulging. The alcohol he had consumed was fueling a fire that had been smoldering for years, the resentment of a mediocre man in the presence of success he felt entitled to but could not replicate. He looked at the brochure for Silver Creek, then at the luxury around him, and finally at me. The logic in his eyes fractured. He realized the con was dead. The persuasion hadn't worked. The guilt trip hadn't worked. All that was left was the rage of a cornered animal. "I'm not leaving," Marcus said, his voice low and trembling. "And you're not kicking my parents out into a blizzard. You think you're so powerful, old man. You think you can just dictate terms. You're alone. There's 3 of us and 1 of you." "There is 1 of me," I agreed. "And I am the owner of this house. That is the only math that matters." "The hell it is," Marcus roared. He stood up so abruptly his chair toppled backward, crashing onto the floor. "You think you're untouchable. You're a relic. You're a ghost haunting a house that doesn't belong to you anymore. It belongs to the future. It belongs to us." He lifted the bottle of champagne, Eleanor's 1982 vintage, the symbol of our enduring love, the holy water of this house, and wielded it like a club. The air in the room crackled with violence. The storm outside hammered against the glass, matching the tempest inside. "Marcus, stop!" Sarah screamed, finally finding her voice. But it was too late. The dam had burst. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. He didn't see a father-in-law. He saw an obstacle. He saw a wall that refused to crumble. And Marcus was a man who, when faced with a wall he couldn't climb, tried to smash it down. "You want to talk about math?" Marcus yelled, swinging the bottle back. "Here's the math. You're done. You're finished. Get out of my way or I will move you myself." I stood my ground. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my hands to protect my face. I simply watched him, cataloging the moment, recording the evidence. I knew, with the certainty of a man who has calculated load limits his entire life, that we had reached the point of catastrophic failure. The structure of this family was about to collapse. The 1982 champagne bottle did not just break, it detonated. Marcus hurled it with the full force of his impotent rage, the heavy green glass striking the marble mantelpiece just inches from my head. The sound was deafening, a chaotic symphony of destruction that silenced the howling wind outside. Shards of glass and foaming wine, Eleanor's favorite vintage, the liquid embodiment of a memory we would now never revisit, sprayed across the hearth and the Persian rug like shrapnel. A large, jagged piece of glass skidded across the floor and came to rest against Sarah's shoe. The room froze. The only sound was the hissing of the fire as the alcohol doused the logs, sending up a plume of steam that smelled of burnt oak and wasted potential. I didn't flinch. I didn't wipe the spray of champagne from my cheek. I simply looked at the fireplace, observing the deep chip in the Carrara marble, a scar that would never heal. Then I looked at Sarah. This was the moment. The load-bearing test. I waited for her to scream, to rush to my side, to slap her husband for threatening her father with physical violence. I waited for the daughter I had raised, the girl I had taught to ride a bike, the woman I had walked down the aisle, to stand up and reject this brutality. But Sarah did not move. She stared at the broken glass, her face pale, her hands trembling in her lap. She didn't look at me. She didn't check if I was bleeding. She simply shrank into herself, a structure collapsing under its own weight. "He's right, Dad," she whispered, her voice so faint it was almost swallowed by the storm. She looked up, her eyes devoid of the warmth I had nurtured for 40 years, replaced by a cold, desperate survival instinct. "The Sullivans, they need this place more than you. It's too big. It's just things. You'd better leave. Please. Before he gets worse." It was a betrayal so absolute, so chemically pure, that it severed the last tether holding me to the room. Frank Sullivan let out a breath he had been holding, and a smirk crept back onto his face. He leaned back, picking up his fork again. "You heard her, Arthur. Majority rules. Democracy in action." Joyce dabbed at her lips with a napkin, avoiding my gaze but nodding in agreement. "It's for the best, Arthur. You'll be safer at Silver Creek. We'll take care of everything here." Marcus stood panting, his chest heaving, his eyes wild with the adrenaline of violence. He pointed a trembling finger at the front door. "Get out," he snarled. "Pack a bag if you want, but you're leaving tonight. I'm done asking. This is our house now." I stood there for a moment, the smell of the ruined vintage filling my nose. I looked at the 3 predators and the 1 coward. They thought this was a victory. They thought they had bullied the old man into submission. They saw my silence as surrender. They didn't understand that a structural engineer does not argue with a building that is on fire, he simply evacuates and triggers the containment protocols. "As you wish," I whispered. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't go upstairs to retrieve my clothes or my toiletries. I simply turned and walked out of the dining room. My footsteps on the hardwood echoed with a heavy, deliberate cadence. I walked into the foyer, the scene of their earlier intrusion, and pulled my heavy wool coat from the closet. I put on my gloves, my hat, and wrapped my scarf around my neck. I could hear them behind me, the tension in the dining room already dissolving into the manic energy of celebration. They were probably already uncorking the whiskey, toasting to their coup. I opened the front door and the blizzard hit me like a physical blow. The wind screamed, driving snow into my face, blinding white and freezing cold. It was fitting. The world outside was hostile, but it was honest. The cold inside the house was far more insidious. I stepped out onto the porch, pulling the heavy door shut behind me. I didn't slam it. I closed it with a soft click, the sound of a vault locking. I walked to my Range Rover, the snow already ankle-deep on the driveway. The cold bit through my layers, but I felt a strange, burning heat in my chest. It wasn't anger anymore. It was the ignition of the failsafe. I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The dashboard lit up, a digital oasis in the storm. I didn't put the car in gear immediately. Instead, I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened the app that controlled the estate smart systems, a system I had designed, a system Eleanor had insisted we install for security. She had been right, as always. But the security wasn't just for burglars. It was for usurpers. I navigated to the admin panel. My finger hovered over a command labeled Protocol, Bad Faith. It was a script Eleanor's lawyer had helped me draft years ago, buried deep in the trust's operational code. It was designed for a scenario where the beneficiary acted against the intent of the grantor. It was the nuclear auction. I looked back at the house. The windows were glowing with warm, golden light. I could see shadows moving in the dining room, Marcus raising a glass, Frank laughing. They were warm. They were full. They felt like kings. I pressed the button. The screen flashed red once, confirm execution. I pressed yes. Command sent. System lockdown in T-5 minutes. I put the car in gear and drove down the long, winding driveway. I didn't look back. I didn't need to see what was coming. I knew exactly how the mechanics would work. In 5 minutes, the automated shutters would slam down over every window, sealing the house like a tomb. The smart locks would engage, deadbolting every door from the inside and outside, rendering physical keys useless. And then, the piece de resistance, the heating system would shut down, the boilers would drain, and the main power breaker would trip, severing the connection to the grid. They wanted the house. They could have it. But they would have it on my terms. They were about to learn that a house is not a home without the person who maintains its heart. They were about to spend Christmas Eve in a darker, colder place than they could ever imagine. I checked into the Vanderbilt, a hotel that understood the value of silence and discretion, 10 minutes later. The concierge, a man named Elias who had known me for 20 years, didn't ask why I was arriving on Christmas Eve without luggage. He simply handed me a key card and instructed the kitchen to send up a pot of Earl Grey and a sandwich. I went up to the suite, removed my coat, and sat in a high-backed leather chair by the window. Outside, the blizzard was erasing the city, burying the world in white. Inside, I was about to watch a demolition. I opened my laptop and logged into the breakwater's security interface. The screen flickered to life, dividing into a grid of 12 high-definition feeds. I wasn't watching out of voyeurism, I was watching for confirmation. A structural engineer does not simply assume the charges will detonate, he verifies the collapse. The feed from the dining room was crisp, the audio capturing every clink of glass and every slur of speech. They hadn't moved far. The broken champagne bottle still lay on the hearth, a jagged monument to Marcus's temper, but the mood had shifted from violence to a manic, victorious relief. I told you, Marcus was saying, pacing the length of the rug with a glass of brown liquor in his hand, my 25-year-old scotch, no doubt. I told you he just needed a push. Old people are like that. They get set in their ways. They don't know what's good for them until you make the decision for them. He gestured with the glass, splashing liquid onto the hardwood. He walked out. You saw him. He didn't even fight. He knows it's over. He knows he's obsolete. Sarah was sitting at the table, her head in her hands. She looked less like a victor and more like a casualty. He looked so cold, she mumbled, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. He didn't take a coat, Marcus. It's 10 below zero. Marcus stopped pacing and leaned over her, placing a heavy hand on her shoulder. It wasn't a comforting gesture, it was a restraint. He has a car, Sarah. He has credit cards. He'll check into a hotel and cool off. Tomorrow, he'll sign the papers, and he'll thank us. We're saving him from the burden of this place. Frank Sullivan was already physically claiming the territory. On the screen, I watched him walk over to the sideboard and pick up the silver candelabra, weighing it in his hand like a pawnbroker assessing collateral. Heavy, he grunted. Sterling, probably. We should get this appraised. No point in having assets gathering dust. He turned to Joyce, who was busy examining the curtains. Joyce, leave the drapes. Come have a drink. We're landed gentry now. Joyce laughed, a shrill sound that grated against the microphone. I'm just looking at the fabric, Frank. It's velvet. Heavy. Must be a nightmare to clean. We'll rip these down first thing. Put up something lighter. Shears. Modernize the place. She walked over to the table and poured herself a drink, using the crystal goblet I had toasted Eleanor with on our wedding day. To the new era, she declared, raising the glass. To family taking care of family. They clinked glasses, Marcus, Frank, and Joyce. Sarah hesitated, then slowly raised her glass, bullied by the momentum of their greed. To family, she whispered, drinking the poison. I watched them from my hotel room, sipping my tea. They looked so comfortable. They looked so assured. They believed that possession was 9/10 of the law, forgetting that the law is a complex mechanism of deeds, trusts, and clauses. They were celebrating the theft of a ship, unaware that the captain had already scuttled the hull. I'm taking the master suite, Frank announced, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. I've got a bad back. I need the mattress with the best support. Marcus nodded magnanimously. It's yours, Dad. Sarah and I will take the east wing. We can turn the library into an office for the crypto operation. I need space for the server racks. The library, I said aloud to the empty hotel room. The library was lined with first editions. It was where Eleanor had read poetry to me. It was the heart of the house. And Marcus wanted to fill it with server racks to mine invisible coins. The desecration was total. They weren't just taking the house, they were erasing the history within it. They were termites, consuming the structure from the inside out, blind to the fact that they were eating the very beams holding the roof over their heads. I glanced at the timer on my screen. Protocol activation, T-2 minutes. The system was running through its pre-flight checks. The external shutters were silently unlocking from their housings, ready to drop. The smart locks were engaging the deadbolts. The generator was spooling down, preparing to sever the connection. Inside the house, they were oblivious. They were discussing paint colors. They were discussing which furniture to sell. They were discussing how to spend the equity they hadn't yet stolen. It's chilly in here, Joyce complained, rubbing her arms. Marcus, turn up the thermostat. If we're paying for the heat, well, if he's paying for it, we might as well be warm. Marcus laughed. On it. Let's crank it to 80. Let's roast. He pulled out his phone, likely trying to access the smart home app. I watched him tap the screen, frown, and tap again. That's odd, Marcus muttered, staring at his phone. App's not loading. Must be the storm interfering with the Wi-Fi. He shrugged, dismissing the first warning tremor of the earthquake. I'll do it manually on the wall. He walked toward the hallway thermostat. I leaned forward in my chair. The digital timer on my screen hit midnight. Status, executing lockdown. Phase 1, perimeter seal. On the video feed, a low, mechanical hum began to vibrate through the house. It was a sound I knew well, the sound of heavy-duty hurricane shutters descending. Frank looked up from his drink. What's that noise? Sounds like a train. Probably just the wind, Joyce said, dismissing it. Or the heating kicking in. No, Marcus said, stopping in the hallway. He looked at the window at the end of the corridor. That's not the wind. Suddenly, the view from the dining room window went black. Not the black of night, but the absolute, metallic black of a steel shutter slamming into place. Thud. Then another. Thud. Then another. The sound rippled through the house like a drumroll of doom. The light from the storm was extinguished, replaced by the artificial glow of the chandelier. What the hell? Frank stood up, knocking his chair over. Who closed the blinds? Those aren't blinds, Marcus said, his voice rising in pitch. He ran to the window and pounded on the glass. It's metal. The security shutters. They just came down. Well, open them back up. Joyce screeched. It's claustrophobic. I can't. Marcus yelled, tapping furiously on his phone. The app is locked out. It says, access denied, administrative override. I watched them panic. I watched them realize that the fortress they had stormed was now a prison. And I knew, with a grim satisfaction, that the show was just beginning. The shutters were just the curtain call. The main event, the darkness, was seconds away. The dining room of the breakwater had transformed from a banquet hall into a bunker. On my laptop screen, the video feed switched automatically to night vision mode, painting my family in ghostly shades of green and gray. The heavy steel shutters blocked out the storm, but they also blocked out the world. Inside, the panic was immediate and undignified. Joyce was clawing at the curtains, shrieking about her heart condition, while Frank stumbled around the table, knocking over the very candelabra he had planned to appraise. Marcus was still at the wall panel, hammering the touch screen with the heel of his hand, as if percussive maintenance could override a military-grade security protocol. It's not working. Marcus screamed, his voice cracking. The system is frozen. It says, lockdown initiated by owner. That bastard locked us in. He turned to Sarah, who was sitting motionless in her chair, the only one not running around like a rat in a maze. Call him, Sarah. Call your father right now and tell him to open these damn doors. Sarah slowly pulled her phone from her pocket. She looked at the screen, then looked up at Marcus with hollow eyes. No signal, she whispered. The shutters, they're metal. They're acting like a Faraday cage. We have no service. Marcus snatched the phone from her hand, staring at the empty signal bars. He hurled the device across the room. It skidded across the floor and hit the wall, cracking the screen. Useless, he roared. The whole damn place is a trap. I took a sip of my Earl Grey, the bergamot steam warming my face. I wasn't cruel, I was thorough. When Eleanor and I retrofitted the estate in 2010, we installed the shutters for hurricane protection, but I had specifically requested the RF blocking mesh for the master suite and lower levels. I valued my privacy. Now, I valued the isolation. They were cut off from the cloud, from their crypto wallets, and from the police. They were alone with the consequences of their actions. Then came the darkness. I tapped the power cycle command on my keyboard. On the screen, the chandelier flickered once, a dying star gasping for energy, and then surrendered. The room plunged into absolute blackness. The video feed on my laptop flared for a second as the infrared sensors adjusted, illuminating the room in a stark, grainy monochrome. The screams were instantaneous. Joyce sounded like a banshee. Frank was cursing, stumbling into furniture. I heard the crash of fine china shattering, likely the dinner plates being swept off the table in the confusion. Stay calm. Marcus yelled, though his voice was trembling. It's just a fuse. The generator will kick in. It's a multi-million-dollar house. It has a backup generator. Just wait 10 seconds. I watched the seconds tick by on my screen. 10. 20. 30. The generator did not kick in. I had disabled the automatic transfer switch 5 minutes ago. The house was dead. The hum of the refrigerator ceased. The subtle vibration of the heating system, which pumped hot water through the radiant floorboards, faded away. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing down on them like the weight of the ocean. "Why isn't it coming on?" Frank demanded, his voice echoing in the dark. "Marcus, you said you knew how this place worked. Fix it." "I don't know," Marcus shouted back. "He must have cut it remotely. He's crazy. He's trying to freeze us to death." "He's teaching us," Sarah said. Her voice came from the darkness, small but strangely clear. "He's showing us what the house is without him. It's just a pile of rocks." The temperature didn't drop immediately, of course. The house had thermal mass, the stone walls and heavy furniture held the heat of the day. But the psychological chill was instant. They knew what was outside. They knew the blizzard was raging, burying the estate in snow, and they knew that without the boiler, the breakwater would become an icebox within hours. I watched Marcus fumble for his phone, using the flashlight to cut a thin, shaking beam through the gloom. He swept the light over the faces of his parents. They looked less like landed gentry now and more like frightened children. "We have to leave," Joyce whimpered, clutching her fur coat, my wife's fur coat, tighter around her neck. "I can't stay here. It's spooky. And it's going to get cold." "Frank, do something." "We're going," Marcus announced. "Grab the keys. We'll take the car. We'll go to a hotel." He led the way to the front door, the beam of light bouncing erratically. I switched camera feeds to the foyer. I watched Marcus grab the heavy brass handle of the front door and pull. It didn't budge. He pulled again, putting his back into it. "Locked." "The deadbolt is engaged," he muttered. He fumbled with the thumb turn. It spun freely. He disengaged the manual override. "The electronic lock is holding it shut." "Break a window," Frank shouted. "Smash the damn glass." "And go where?" Sarah asked, walking into the frame. "The shutters are down, Frank. They're steel. You can't break them. And even if you broke the glass, you'd just be letting the blizzard in. We're sealed in." Marcus kicked the door, a futile gesture that likely hurt his foot more than the solid oak. "This is kidnapping," he screamed at the ceiling, assuming I could hear him. "This is illegal. You hear me, old man? You're going to jail for this." I wasn't listening to his legal theories. I was watching the external security feed. A pair of headlights cut through the swirling snow at the bottom of the driveway. A vehicle was approaching. It wasn't a guest. It was a sheriff's cruiser, lights flashing silently in the storm. The perimeter alarm I had triggered, unauthorized occupancy, had done its job. The law was arriving. Inside the house, they saw the flicker of blue and red lights bleeding through the tiny gaps in the shutter hinges. "Police!" Joyce cried out, relief flooding her voice. "Thank God." He called the police. "They're here to save us. Help!" Marcus screamed, running to the nearest window. He pounded on the heavy steel shutter. "We're in here. Help us. Open the door." But the storm was howling at 60 miles per hour. The wind was a deafening roar. Inside the house, their screams were loud, but outside, they were nothing more than a whisper against the gale. I picked up my cell phone and dialed the sheriff's direct line. I had played poker with Jim Miller for 15 years. He knew my voice, and he knew my house. Arthur. Jim's voice came through, crackly but audible. I'm out at the breakwater. Dispatch got a silent alarm. Perimeter breach. Everything okay? I see the shutters are down. Jim, I said, keeping my voice calm, the weary tone of a man calling from a distance. I'm afraid I'm in the city for the holiday. The house should be empty. I locked it down remotely when the alarm tripped. I suspect intruders. Squatters, perhaps. With the storm, I didn't want to take any chances. Squatters. Jim grunted. In this weather? Bold. Well, the place is buttoned up tight. I can't see any signs of entry, but with those shutters down, I can't see inside either. Do you want me to try and breach? No, I said quickly. The risk is too high. If the system is in lockdown, they are trapped. They can't steal anything, and they can't leave. Let the storm pass, Jim. It's too dangerous for you to be out there trying to pry open steel doors. Just log it. I'll deal with it when I return after Christmas. Fair enough, Jim said. Roads are getting bad anyway. If they're inside, they aren't going anywhere. Stay warm, Arthur. You too, Jim. I hung up. On the screen, I watched the cruiser's taillights fade into the white void. Inside the foyer, the hope drained out of Marcus's face as the blue lights disappeared. He stopped pounding on the shutter. He slumped against the wall, sliding down until he hit the floor. They left, he whispered. They just left. They couldn't hear us, Sarah said, sitting on the bottom step of the staircase. Dad designed this house to withstand a Category 4 hurricane. Do you really think yelling would work? The temperature in the foyer was already dropping. I could see their breath misting in the flashlight beam. The heat was bleeding out, degree by degree. The fortress they wanted to steal was turning against them. They wanted the estate. They were about to experience the estate in its rawest form, cold, hard, and unforgiving. The night did not pass quickly. It dragged across the timeline of the estate like a glacier, slow, crushing, and inevitably cold. From the comfort of my hotel suite, I watched the thermal telemetry of the breakwater drop with mathematical precision. By 3 a.m., the internal temperature of the Great Hall had stabilized at 42 degrees Fahrenheit. The house, stripped of its artificial pulse, had returned to its natural state, a cavern of stone and glass sitting on a windswept cliff. On the night vision feed, the huddled shapes of my family were indistinguishable from the furniture, motionless lumps gathered around the dead fireplace where the ashes of the logs had long since gone cold. Joyce was wearing Eleanor's sable coat, the one I had bought for her in Milan in 1998, wrapped so tightly around her frame that she looked like a mummified relic. Frank was shivering violently, his earlier bravado stripped away by the relentless chill, huddled under a pile of the tacky throw blankets Joyce had threatened to throw out just hours before. Marcus sat apart from them, staring at the steel shutter blocking the window, his phone dead in his hand. He wasn't plotting anymore, he was enduring. And Sarah. Sarah sat on the floor, hugging her knees, rocking slightly. She wasn't shivering. She was in the early stages of acceptance, realizing that the cold she was feeling wasn't just atmospheric, it was the true temperature of the marriage she had chosen. I slept fitfully, waking every hour to check the feeds, a habit born from years of monitoring curing concrete during winter pours. At 7 a.m., the blizzard finally broke. The howling wind died down to a whisper, and the sun began to rise over the Atlantic, painting the snow-covered world in brilliant, blinding white. It was Christmas morning. A day of peace. A day of giving. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, sat before my laptop, and initiated the final phase of the lesson. Command: terminate lockdown. Sequence: daybreak. On the screen, I saw the reaction instantly. A mechanical groan vibrated through the house as the heavy steel shutters began to retract. Shafts of piercing morning light sliced through the gloom of the dining room, illuminating the wreckage of the night before, the shattered glass, the overturned chairs, the huddle of frozen conspirators. They flinched from the light like creatures of the dark exposed to the sun. Marcus scrambled to his feet, his limbs stiff. "It's opening," he croaked, his voice raspy. "The power, it's back. The doors." He didn't wait for his parents. He didn't wait for his wife. He bolted for the foyer, stumbling on numb feet, fueled by the desperate need to escape the icebox he had tried to steal. I watched him grab the handle of the front door. This time, the lock clicked open. He threw the door wide and practically fell out onto the porch, gasping in the crisp, freezing air. Frank and Joyce were right behind him, clutching their coats, looking less like high society squatters and more like refugees from a disaster of their own making. Sarah followed last, walking slowly, stepping over the threshold with a strange, dazed dignity. They didn't find a rescue team. They didn't find the police. They found Mr. Sterling. Nathaniel Sterling was my attorney, a man who wore three-piece suits as if they were armor and regarded emotions as inefficient variables in a legal equation. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps, flanked by two private security contractors who looked like they were carved from granite. Sterling wasn't holding blankets or hot cocoa. He was holding a leather binder. "Merry Christmas," Sterling said, his voice carrying clearly in the stillness. He didn't smile. "Who are you?" Marcus demanded, shivering uncontrollably. "Where is the ambulance? We almost died in there. That maniac locked us in." "I am Arthur Vance's legal counsel," Sterling replied, opening the binder with a snap. "And you are currently trespassing on private property. The ambulance has not been called because, according to my client's assessment, the only injuries sustained here are to your egos. However, if you require medical attention, I can direct you to the nearest urgent care facility. After you vacate the premises." Frank stepped forward, his face purple with cold and rage. "Trespassing. We're family. We were invited. He tried to kill us. We're suing him for everything he's got. Attempted murder. False imprisonment." Sterling adjusted his glasses, looking at Frank with the bored expression of a man watching a toddler throw a tantrum. "You were invited for dinner, Mr. Sullivan. You remained for an occupation. And regarding the imprisonment, the house security system merely engaged its automated defense protocol when it detected a hostile takeover event. Specifically, the bad faith clause of the Vance Family Trust." "Bad faith?" Sarah whispered, speaking for the first time. She stood by the railing, looking at the lawyer. "Correct, Mrs. Vance," Sterling said, turning to her. "The deed to the breakwater is held in a trust designed by your late mother, Eleanor Vance. It contains a specific provision, Clause 14b, which states that if any beneficiary or guest attempts to coerce the primary trustee, your father, into liquidating the asset under duress, the trust automatically revokes all guest privileges and initiates a protective lockdown to secure the physical asset." Sterling pulled a document from the binder and held it up. It was a copy of the deed, with the relevant paragraph highlighted in neon yellow. By threatening to move Mr. Vance into a substandard facility and demanding he sign over the equity to cover your husband's significant gambling debts, you triggered the clause. You didn't just break a champagne bottle, Marcus. You broke the covenant of the trust. Legally, as of 8 p.m. last night, you ceased to be guests and became intruders. That's insane, Marcus spat, though he looked less sure now. No court will uphold that. It's a booby trap. It is a contract, Sterling corrected. And it is ironclad. Now, here is the situation. You have 30 minutes to remove your personal effects from the premises. My associates here, he gestured to the 2 guards, will supervise the retrieval of your luggage. You will not touch the furniture. You will not touch the silver. You will certainly not touch the wine cellar. And if we refuse? Joyce screeched, clutching the sable coat. We're not going anywhere. We have rights. Squatters' rights. Sterling finally smiled. It was a terrifying, shark-like expression. Mrs. Sullivan, you have been here for less than 24 hours. You are not a squatter, you are a nuisance. And if you refuse, the sheriff, who is currently parked at the bottom of the lane waiting for my signal, will arrest you for criminal trespass and destruction of property. The vintage champagne your son destroyed was valued at $15,000. The rug you soiled is valued at $50,000. Mr. Vance is willing to waive the charges for the damages, if you leave now and never return. The silence on the porch was absolute. The cold reality washed over them. The scheme was dead. The house was a fortress they couldn't breach. The money was a mirage. Marcus looked at Sarah, waiting for her to argue, to plead, to use the daughter card. Sarah looked at Sterling, then at the house that had shut her out, and finally at her husband. He knew, she said softly. He knew we were coming for him. And he was ready. Your father is a structural engineer, Sarah, Sterling said, closing the binder. He calculates loads. He knew exactly how much weight this family could bear before it collapsed. And he knew exactly how to demolish it safely. He checked his watch. 29 minutes. I suggest you start packing. I watched the exodus from the comfort of the hotel suite, the steam from my tea rising against the cold glass of the window. On the laptop screen, the high-definition feed showed a procession of defeat. It was a stark contrast to the invasion of the previous afternoon. They had arrived with the swagger of conquerors, their chins high, their voices loud, claiming territory they had not earned. Now, they were leaving like refugees, shivering in the biting wind, dragging their belongings across the salted cobblestones of the driveway. The luggage that Frank and Joyce had brought, the heavy, oversized suitcases that I had noted with suspicion, became the source of their final humiliation. As Frank struggled to haul the largest case down the icy porch steps, his foot slipped. He lost his grip. The suitcase tumbled end over end, hitting the bottom step with a sickening crack. The zipper burst. It did not spill out evening wear or toiletries. It spilled out a life. A toaster oven clattered onto the driveway. A tangled nest of extension cords followed. Then came framed photographs, a stack of unopened mail, and a dirty electric kettle. I zoomed in on the feed. You do not bring a toaster oven to a Christmas dinner. You do not bring your entire stack of unpaid bills to a weekend visit. The contents of that suitcase confirmed what I had deduced from the public records. The Sullivans were not just visiting. They had been evicted. They were homeless. They had packed their entire existence into those nylon shells, intending to graft themselves onto my estate like barnacles on a ship's hull. Jesus, Frank. Joyce shrieked, scrambling to gather the debris, her sable coat dragging in the slush. "Pick it up. Don't just stand there." "I'm trying." Frank yelled back, his face a mask of panic. He looked up at the security camera, realizing too late that the lens was capturing every second of their shame. He knew I was watching. He knew that the facade of the wealthy in-laws had just been shattered by a $10 kitchen appliance lying in the snow. Mr. Sterling stood by the Range Rover, watching the scene with the impassive expression of an undertaker waiting for a body. He checked his watch, then walked over to Marcus, who was shoving his own bags into the trunk of his leased Audi. Sterling held out a sleek, black envelope. "Mr. Vance," Sterling said, his voice cutting through the wind. "Before you depart, there is the matter of the outstanding liabilities." Marcus froze. He looked at the envelope as if it contained anthrax. "What liabilities?" "We're leaving. We're doing what he wanted." "What more does he want?" "Restitution," Sterling said calmly. "You destroyed property belonging to the Vance Trust. Specifically, one bottle of 1982 Salon Cuvée S. Le Mesnil Blanc de Blancs, valued at $15,000. And, due to the biohazard contamination of the antique debris rud, mud, salt, and spilled alcohol, it has been deemed a total loss. Replacement value, $52,000. Marcus laughed, a high-pitched, hysterical sound. "He's joking. He's charging me for wine. I'm his son-in-law." "You are a debtor," Sterling corrected. "And as of this morning, a trespasser. Mr. Vance has instructed me to inform you that he will be filing a civil suit for the damages unless immediate payment is rendered. However..." Sterling paused, allowing the silence to stretch. "He is aware of your current liquidity crisis. The failed crypto arbitrage. The maxed-out credit lines. The second mortgage on your own home." Sarah, who was standing by the car door, went rigid. She turned to Marcus. "Second mortgage," she whispered. "Marcus, you said we paid the house off last year. You showed me the statement." Marcus wouldn't look at her. He was staring at Sterling, his jaw working furiously. That was just a bridge loan. Temporary. To cover the margin call. I was going to pay it back once we secured the liquidity from the breakwater. "So you gambled our house," Sarah said, her voice rising. "And then you tried to steal my father's house to cover your loss." "I did it for us." Marcus screamed, slamming his hand on the roof of the Audi. "To build an empire. You think your dad got rich by playing it safe? He took risks. I took a risk. My client took calculated risks on steel and concrete," Sterling interjected smoothly. "You took a gamble on a digital Ponzi scheme. There is a difference between engineering and delusion." He pressed the envelope into Marcus's chest. "Inside is the bill. You have 30 days to pay. If not, the trust will place a lien on whatever assets you have left. Though, looking at the public records, that appears to be very little." Marcus crumbled. The arrogance that had fueled him for years, the belief that he was the smartest man in the room, finally evaporated. He slumped against the car, sliding down until he was sitting on the bumper, burying his face in his hands. He was a structure that had failed its load test. Sterling turned his attention to the Sullivans. Frank and Joyce had finished shoving their sad belongings back into the broken suitcase. They stood there, shivering, looking at the warm, locked house they had hoped to conquer. "And regarding your parents," Sterling said, addressing Marcus but looking at Frank. Mr. Vance has arranged for a one-way transport to a shelter in Providence. Since they have no fixed address, and their vehicle, he gestured to the rusted sedan parked behind the Audi, has an expired registration and bald tires, he felt it would be irresponsible to let them drive in these conditions. A shelter? Joyce gasped, clutching her pearls. We are not homeless people. We are guests. We have dignity. You have a toaster in your driveway, Mrs. Sullivan, Sterling said, his voice devoid of pity. And you have no lease, no credit, and as of 5 minutes ago, no host. The van will be here in 10 minutes. I suggest you wait in your car. I watched Sarah. She stood alone in the middle of the driveway, the snow swirling around her boots. She looked at her husband, broken and weeping on the bumper. She looked at her in-laws, exposed as grifters. And then she looked up at the security camera. Her face was pale, tear-streaked, and filled with a dawn of terrible clarity. She realized that she had traded a fortress of stone and love for a house of cards built on lies. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. My cell phone on the hotel desk buzzed. Incoming call, Sarah. I let it ring. I watched her on the screen, holding the phone to her ear, tears streaming down her face. She was begging. She was apologizing. She was realizing that the silence from her father was an absence, it was a verdict. I didn't answer. I couldn't answer. To answer would be to offer a lifeline, and a lifeline now would only drag her back into the quicksand she had chosen. She needed to hit the bottom. She needed to feel the solid, hard truth of the rock bottom before she could ever hope to rebuild. I watched her lower the phone, the screen going dark. She looked at the house one last time, the breakwater, standing tall and impervious against the winter sky, and then she got into the passenger seat of the Audi. Sterling nodded to the guards. The eviction was complete. The parasites had been purged. The house was empty, cold, and silent. But it was safe. I closed the laptop. The silence in the hotel room was profound. It wasn't the silence of loneliness, it was the silence of a job finished. I had protected the legacy. I had honored Eleanor's will. I had taught the lesson. Now, all that remained was the final demolition. The week following Christmas was defined not by celebration, but by the quiet, methodical work of clearing rubble. I returned to the breakwater only once, accompanied by Mr. Sterling and a team of professional movers who packed boxes with the reverence of archaeologists. The house, once a fortress against the storm, now felt like a shell. The warmth had returned with the power, but the spirit of the place, the lingering presence of Eleanor, the laughter we had shared in the kitchen, the safety I had felt within these stone walls, had evaporated. It had been displaced by the memory of the invasion, tainted by the greed that had seeped into the carpets and the curtains. I sat in the library, the only room left untouched, and listened to the voicemails. I didn't listen to them out of sentimentality. I listened to them as one listens to the black box recording of a plane crash, analyzing the sequence of failures that led to the impact. The first was from Marcus, timestamped December 26, 10 a.m. His voice was tight, oscillating between aggression and panic. Arthur, look, we need to talk. The lawyer sent the bill. You can't be serious. $50,000 for a rug. We're family. You need to call off the dogs. I'm willing to forget the whole lockout thing if you just drop the lawsuit. Let's be adults here. I deleted it without a change in expression. There was no negotiation with a terrorist, and there was no bargaining with a parasite. The second was from Sarah, 2 days later. Her voice was different. The passivity was gone, replaced by the raw, jagged edge of a woman watching her life disintegrate. Dad. Marcus lied. He lied about everything. The bank came today. They're foreclosing on our house. The second mortgage, he forged my signature on the application. I didn't know. Please, Dad. I don't know what to do. The Sullivans are staying in a motel on our credit card, and it's maxed out. I'm scared. Please call me. I paused, my finger hovering over the delete button. I looked at the photo of Sarah on the desk, taken when she was 7, holding a model bridge we had built together out of popsicle sticks. She had been so proud of that structure, testing it with weights until it held. Somewhere along the way, she had forgotten the lesson: you cannot build a life on a foundation of lies and expect it to hold when the wind blows. I didn't delete the message, but I didn't return the call. To intervene now would be to shore up a condemned building. She needed to let it collapse so she could see the rot in the wreckage. The final message was from Marcus again, but the arrogance was gone. He sounded drunk, or perhaps just broken. They're taking the car, Arthur. The Audi. It was a lease. I missed 3 payments. Sarah left. She went to stay with a friend. I don't have anywhere to go. You win, okay? You win. Just help me out. Alone. Anything. I pressed delete. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was clean. Mr. Sterling entered the library, carrying a thick sheaf of documents. He placed them on the desk, right next to the spot where Marcus had tried to bully me into submission on Christmas Eve. The sale is finalized, Mr. Vance, Sterling said, his tone professional but softened by years of friendship. The buyers are a young couple from Boston. Architects. They appreciate the structural history. They promise to keep the original windows. Good, I said, picking up my pen. And the proceeds? Fully liquidated, Sterling confirmed. After the settlement of the bad faith damages, which we deducted from the small trust fund you had set aside for Sarah, the net total is $4.8 million. He paused, looking at me over the rim of his glasses. Are you sure about the allocation, Arthur? This is a total disinheritance. It is irreversible. I looked out the window at the ocean, gray and churning under the winter sky. I thought of the brochure for Silver Creek. I thought of the toaster oven in the driveway. I thought of the word selfish thrown at me like a stone. It is not a disinheritance, Nathaniel, I said, uncapping the pen. It is a redirection of resources. Sarah has a law degree I paid for. She has a mind I helped cultivate. If she is truly my daughter, she will survive the collapse of her marriage and rebuild. If I give her this money now, Marcus, or the next Marcus she finds, will drain it in a year. Money cannot fix a structural flaw in character. Only hardship can do that. I signed the first document. The ink flowed smoothly, black and permanent. The funds are to be transferred immediately to the Eleanor Vance Foundation, I instructed. The mandate is specific: full-ride scholarships for students in structural engineering and architecture who come from underprivileged backgrounds. Students who know the value of a brick because they have had to carry them. Sterling nodded, taking the signed paper. And the house? You're walking away from 40 years of history. I am walking away from a building, I corrected. The history is in my head. The home I built with Eleanor died when she did. This. I gestured around the room, at the empty shelves and the cold fireplace. This is just a pile of rocks. It served its purpose. It sheltered us. It protected us. And in the end, it revealed the truth. I stood up and buttoned my coat. I didn't look back at the room. I walked out of the library, through the foyer, and onto the porch. The movers were closing the back of the truck. The driveway was clean, the snow shoveled, the debris of the Sullivan invasion swept away. I got into my Range Rover, the engine humming to life. I felt lighter than I had in years. The grief was still there, a dull ache that would never fully heal, but the burden of expectation was gone. I was no longer the custodian of a legacy that my family was waiting to consume. I was just Arthur. And for the first time since Eleanor passed, the road ahead didn't feel like a dead end. It felt like a construction site, ready for something new. I drove down the winding lane, passing the spot where the sheriff had parked, passing the gates that had locked my family in. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. A good engineer looks forward, scanning the horizon for the next stress point, the next challenge. I had survived the eviction of my own heart. I had tested the load, and I was still standing. 6 months later, the ice had finally thawed from the cliffs of Newport, replaced by the violent bloom of hydrangeas and the scent of salt spray that didn't bite quite as hard as it did in December. I sat in my new car, a modest sedan, efficient and reliable, parked on the shoulder of the coastal road, looking up at the breakwater. Scaffolding hugged the west wing where the new owners, the young architect couple, were already restoring the original limestone facade. I watched as a contractor carried a window frame, one of the 1920s oak originals, out to a truck to be refinished, not replaced. There was a profound sense of peace in seeing the structure respected, treated not as a piggy bank to be smashed open, but as a piece of history to be preserved. The sale had closed quietly in February. The proceeds, all $4.8 million of it, had vanished from my ledger and reappeared in the accounts of the Eleanor Vance Foundation. I had received the first batch of letters from the scholarship recipients just last week. One was from a young man in Detroit, the son of a mechanic, who wanted to study civil engineering but couldn't afford the tuition. He wrote about wanting to build bridges that brought communities together. I read that letter with a glass of cheap, supermarket wine in my hand, and it tasted better than any vintage champagne I had ever stored in that damp cellar. I was no longer hoarding a fortress, I was building foundations for lives I would never meet. As for the rubble I had cleared from my life, the reports reached me through the sterile, necessary filter of Mr. Sterling. Marcus was currently facing 3 counts of wire fraud. It turned out the crypto arbitrage wasn't just a bad investment, it was a Ponzi scheme he had been running on his own friends. He was living in a studio apartment in Providence, awaiting trial, his arrogance finally stripped away by the harsh friction of reality. The Sullivans had evaporated into the ether of New Jersey, likely looking for another host to attach themselves to, but they would find no purchase here. Their names were flagged in every credit bureau in the tri-state area, a final parting gift from my lawyer. And Sarah, my daughter. The report on her was the hardest to read, yet it offered the only glimmer of structural integrity. She had not called me again. She had not asked for money. According to Sterling, she was working as a paralegal in a small firm in Boston, living in a walk-up with 2 roommates. She was taking the bus. She was paying her own rent. It was a humble existence, one far removed from the country clubs and luxury cars she had been promised, but it was real. For the first time in her life, she was supporting her own weight. I hoped, with the quiet desperation of a father, that the concrete was finally curing. I shifted the car into drive, the engine humming softly. I took one last look at the house. It stood tall against the blue sky, a monument to the life Eleanor and I had built. But that's all it was now, a monument. A memory. It wasn't my home. My home was the peace of mind I carried with me, the knowledge that I had refused to compromise my dignity for the sake of a hollow peace. Eleanor had been right to include the bad faith clause, not because she wanted to punish our family, but because she knew that true love sometimes requires a demolition order. You cannot save a building that is rotting from the inside. You must tear it down to the bedrock and start over. I drove away from the cliff, merging onto the highway that would take me inland, toward the small cottage I had purchased near a quiet lake in Vermont. I had no guest rooms there. I had no wine cellar. I had a porch where I could sit and watch the sunset without wondering who was plotting to take the chair from under me. The road ahead was open, clear of snow and debris. I was 72 years old. I had lost a wife. I had lost a house. I had estranged a daughter. But as I watched the ocean fade in the rearview mirror, I realized I hadn't lost anything essential. I had simply shed the load I was never meant to carry. This story stands as a testament to a simple engineering truth: gravity always wins. What is built on lies, on greed, on the expectation of inheritance, is built on sand. It may stand for a season, it may look magnificent when the sun shines, but when the blizzard comes, and the blizzard always comes, it will fall. And when it does, do not be afraid to stand amidst the ruins, knowing that you are the rock that remains. Do not mistake silence for weakness, and do not mistake a long fuse for a lack of explosive power. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is let the people you love face the storm without your umbrella, so they can finally learn how to build their own shelter. I turned on the radio. Jazz played, soft and complex. I tapped my fingers on the steering wheel, driving toward a future that was smaller, quieter, and infinitely more my own. I was Arthur Vance. I was a builder. And for the first time in a long time, the foundation was solid.